Changeworking, moving minds for change that lasts.
Hello, friends, and welcome to Changeworking, a show for practitioners and coaches who help their clients create change. My name is Ruckus, and as always, I'll be in conversation with James Tripp. Today, we're talking about parts work, the multiplicity of the mind. It's the idea that there is no one unified you. And this is a model, it's a framework, it's a way of looking at the human mind, but it's also an incredibly powerful, useful tool for change work. So let's get right into it. Here is my conversation with James about parts. I've lost track of how many times just random podcasts that have nothing to do with change work, people say, there's a part of me that da-da-da-da-da. And I love that. People naturally, they just aren't taught that you can talk to the parts and they'll answer you back.
Yeah. You can talk to the parts, you can activate the parts, you can deactivate the parts, or if you prefer, you can ask your unconscious mind to activate the part or deactivate the part.
Yeah.
There's kind of quite a lot you can just do with that organization of things. So this idea of parts is quite natural for people, I think. And it's just a way of recognizing, look, we're not one singular unit with one singular intention. If we were, nobody would ever have any ambivalence about anything. They would just do the things they did, never have any regrets. But we're not like that all the time. There's a part of us that wants to do something. There's a part of us that wants to do something else. So this is something that's a very natural thing for everybody. To me, it's just it's a useful framework. And it happens sort of organically. So even when you're doing something like in feeling to metaphor, well, that metaphor is a part. Basically, you might not use the language parts, but, I was doing this with one of the clients yesterday. It's a very common one, a knot, She said it's like a knot, like a dog toy, like a knotted together rope dog toy she had there. So like I could have carried on with that, but even when you're doing, and I said, and when there's a knotted dog toy there, what would you like to have happen? I want it to go. And what does it want? Just be with that for a moment. Right. So it's positive intention, isn't what does it want? Now, I haven't used the word part, but we're still basically doing the same thing here.
Yeah. And the thing is, I used to really kind of say things like, this may sound odd to you or sound crazy, but we can talk directly to that knot. And I've just realized you don't even have to do that. Yeah. People just talk to the knot. With you just say, hey, well, what does that knot know?
Yeah.
And they'll just do it. There's no.
That's it.
Yeah.
What is that? What does that not want? And sometimes you might get I don't know, right? In which case you say, okay, so if you were to just be with it with just a little more release, a little more ease, just be with it now. And I often do this thing. I say, just see it. Say hello. I see you, right? Mm-hmm. Or I say, like, it's a bit that I like, which is, if you were to be with that like you were going to be with an old friend. Now, some people are averse to that because they go, I hate that part. I can't be with it. But if you can get them to be with it like an old friend, right? And you were to communicate with it, what might that want? What does it want to tell you that it wants? There's ways to get past that barrier.
The more I've done it, the more I've realized that there's not even really much of a barrier for most people most of the time.
For most people, right.
Yeah, they just go with it. And I stopped couching it as much as I used to because it wasn't even necessary.
Right. So there's another kind of thing you can do with parts as well, which is when you have what you might call an externalized problem. I got this book by a guy called Ramsey Dukes, also known as Lionel Snell. He wrote a book called My Years in Magical Thinking.
Those are both two great names.
Yeah. But he's got this book called The Little Book of Demons. And basically, he's advocating for that you experience problems in your life as being as the result of demons or gremlins or whatever. Now, if you start to see it as a demon, well, he says, the point is you can negotiate with a demon. You can discuss things. You can come to terms and these sorts of things, right? But I don't tend to use that frame. But if you think of it like I prefer gremlin because it's got less religious connotation. But then once you've got it externalized, now it's not a part of me, it's a part from me, right? In the psychological rendering of it. It's like, okay, so what does that have you think? What does that gremlin have you think? What does it have you do? What are its plans for you? What does it intend for you? right? So if you've got like a problem, like I've got anxiety, and you start asking, so what does anxiety have you thinking? Now you kind of flip it round because you actually get the thinking that creates the anxiety, but you flipped it round in the organization, right? And what are anxiety's plans for you in life? What does it intend for you? Right? People go there really easily. I wants me to hide, right? Now, that's what its plans are, but that's a positive intention, isn't it, right? So you're into hiding, but it's a different way of asking it. What are its plans for you? What does it intend for you in life?
That's the entirety of the IFS framework, is that all the parts have a positive intention. They all have a positive intention,
Yeah.
regardless of the results that they're causing in your life.
Yeah.
And it's always down to uncovering the positive intention. But I know I hear you say, like, hello, I see you. And that's very similar in the way IFS approaches, is like many of these parts have never been spoken to directly, never been acknowledged that they exist.
Yeah.
And just acknowledging they exist and accepting that you understand they have a positive intention, just that relaxes them and they open up and are open to that conversation. I always ask, just ask them if they're open to having a conversation with us. And then they'll go in and the client will go ask, and they come back, said, yeah, they'll have a conversation with us. And just that simple little beat there just relaxes so much. But you were talking about the inner demons. It goes back to that, the kind of angel on a shoulder and devil on a shoulder. I mean, everyone grows up knowing that, and that's straight up parts work.
Right.
Just in a framing of good and bad.
Which is kind of Ramsey Duke's point in his little book of demons. It's like in older times when people go, there's a demon influencing my life or whatever.
Right.
It's like, well, are we actually just talking about the same thing as a part?
Yes.
Is it just sitting within a different conceptual system? And his answer is, yes, it is. But there is an additional value. And the way I would see it is instead of seeing it as a part of you, as psychologically rendering it as a part from you. And this kind of fits with the narrative therapy guys, because they've got this, they call it externalizing problems. And their main thing is, you are not the problem is the problem. So sometimes if somebody goes, there's a part of me that is really insecure, then they still associate too much with that. And they go, well, it's my flaw because it's like a part of me, the insecure thing. But if the insecurity is apart from you and it's just something that's trying to get you to do something for whatever reason, you have a different sort of relationship with it. But as Ramsey Dukes points out, you've still personified it. And by personifying the part, it activates different neural networks. It activates all your social intelligence, which if you just have it abstracted as I have anxiety, none of your social intelligence circuits are available, and all of the intelligence they contain, that's not available then because you haven't personified it.
I'm so passionate about parts work. Just me in my personal life, in my personal change of becoming a better person, parts has specifically, I've had the biggest shifts in my life, and that's why I'm so passionate about it.
Yeah. Is that as being on the receiving end of official parts work processes, so to speak, or just the concept in and of itself?
Both in all of it. What I've tended, like I said before, I'll restate because we hadn't talked about it. I've been doing for 3 or 4 months now, weekly internal family systems therapy as a client. She's a psychologist who has a PhD and did 20 years of just standard psychology before she started doing internal family systems. Now that's all she does. Right. So she has that background. So that's why I was like, okay, I'll find out if I like whatever. Anyway, what we've mostly discovered is that she as a facilitator has helped me to understand and find the parts and connect with them and name them. And then on my own, because of my own training, I separately, then the rest of the week, I end up doing in IFS, they call it an unburdening, where you release the trauma. But I end up using random things like, this is why I was so interested in timeline. I end up using timeline and other submodality stuff to do the similar quote unquote unburdening. It's just a separate process. But so it's been a combination of both of those. I do find having someone else be a facilitator as I'm working with parts has been helpful to have a third party. But we haven't yet done a traditional where we do the unburdening in the session. So, but it's been both. But I found out when I was doing hypnosis, and then I learned parts later on after I had a hypnosis foundation, that more and more my sessions with clients were almost entirely parts work. I just connected. Sometimes you just as a practitioner connect to a certain way of working, and once I found out that way that you can have the client go in to ask a question, ask that part if this. They'll go in, get an answer, come back and say it to me. And it's just I can have a direct conversation with that part through the client. It just blew my mind. That was so cool to me.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
anyway.
I think it's worth connecting with parts thinking for any practitioner. And the reason I asked you the question, was it good for you as a result of the formal processes you've been facilitated through or conceptually? Because I know going way, way back, for me, being introduced to a parts framework, which I was introduced to that through NLP, because NLP play around with parts and this kind of thing as well. It was incredibly liberating for me just to realize that I was not, all of the ambivalences in my life and apparently the contradictions and the hypocrisies and all of this all made sense because there wasn't just one me.
Right.
Call it whatever you want, ego states or whatever, different neural networks. This stuff is kind of old. It goes back to Gurdjieff's work at least. And I think this might be the origin of parts work, but we already said, go back even further, people would talk about angels and demons and these kinds of things. I think it's quite a natural, very archetypal way of us to relate to things. But Gurdjieff had this idea that we had these different selves. And this is why we find that there's a self that says, come New Year, right, I'm really going to get in shape. And that self really means it. That part really means it. And then, there's another part that wants to eat those donuts or just wants to just lie in the morning instead of getting up and going running or something like that.
Right.
For me, I used to think, what's wrong with me? I can't get myself to do X. Listen to that. I can't get myself to do whatever. And I think one of the things for me is realizing that this is how we're supposed to work. That was incredibly liberating. And there's a book, which I think I've mentioned before, but I'll mention it right now in the context of this, called Society of Mind by Marvin Minsky. And he was an AI developer, like an old school AI developer from the 70s and 80s. And they used to try and create these one brains to make things happen. He's got a singular brain that would make a robot walk. And they were always a disaster. And what they found in the end, they could solve the problem by having a series of brains that communicated with each other.
Right.
That each had a specific part of the robot to run. Right.
It's a multiprocessor.
Yeah. And then he came to realize, well, this is how we work. We human beings work this way. We don't have one, he calls them agencies, right? These different agencies. We have these different agencies that want to do different things. One example he gives is a little kid might have a tower building agency. So he wants to build a tower out of blocks. And then there's another agency that wants to smash the block tower down.
Right.
So he's going to build the thing. And then at some point, that part, block building part, goes offline. Online comes tower knocking down part. And you go, what does this kid want? Does he want to build a tower or does he want to knock it down? Well, yeah, there's a part that wants to build the tower and a part that wants to knock it down, or a part whose job, Marvin Minsky would say, is to build towers, and a part whose job is to knock towers down. And what's important is that neither one part dominates the other, because you become dysfunctional. So say I've got a part of me that wants to work and create, and there's a part of me that wants to rest as well. But if the part that wants to work and create takes over and becomes super dominant and is able to absolutely bend all other parts to its will, then I work myself to death in no time at all. So Minsky points out that we have these parts, although he uses different language, and it would be dysfunctional to have one part be able to dominate all the rest. It would be a flaw, a fault. So we are meant to be a collection of different agencies, different desires, different skill sets, whatever, that come on and offline in a sort of collective fashion. And if you go back to Gurdjieff's point was, we're not there to decide which one of these parts is the true us or which self is the true us. We are there to create a harmonious interaction between them, which is, I don't know, I would use the term generative. And to me, this is why parts work. It's just so deep in everything. The other reason I think it's really powerful to get into parts work and thinking about things in terms of parts work is because it can serve as a foundation for any other kind of work. And you said this for yourself with, now I'm using timeline in relation to a part.
Right.
Because if we think of a part as being a neural network, let's say, if we put it in sort of neuropsychological terms, we go, okay, this part's a neural network. Well, the question is, when did it form? It has a history.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a neural network, it has a history.
Mm-hmm.
So when we start working with it historically, well, now we're in the realm of timeline or regression, or, someone might like to use a wounded inner child model. I'm not a huge fan of that framing, but it can be utilized. So now, for me, it's like you want to take your parts work as the first place you go. If you're going to get into kind of regression work or remembering work or anything like that, stuff that works with history, you want to go parts first and then get the history on those parts. Now, the other place that it's really, really good to think in terms of parts is if you're a practitioner, is remember you are not speaking to your client necessarily in totality when you say, what do you want?
Right. Which part are you talking to?
So that part that shows up isn't necessarily the part, quote unquote, that is the thing, the problem, quote unquote. You're not necessarily speaking to that part.
Right.
And you might not even be speaking to a particularly resourceful part. You might be speaking at a part that's angry at the part that has a problem. And that angry part doesn't have the resources to sort the problem out, and might also have its own agenda, which could be dysfunctional in and of itself. I would often say, if you're getting into change work and you've got clients come up, they say, I want to do this. It's like, okay, but be aware that the client doesn't entirely want to do that.
Right.
Not all parts of the client want to do that. Like even something like smoking cessation, if all parts of the client were aligned with stopping smoking, they wouldn't be hiring you.
Right.
There's ambivalence there.
Right. I know this, how you frame everything, but like almost any time that there's any client presents the challenge or the problem or whatever they're wanting to work with, I can almost always in my mind, okay, there's a part that's, it's just such a natural way. Like this, I don't know if this is too big sweeping of a statement, but once I really got into parts, specifically the IFS model, it explained all human behavior to me suddenly. Looking through that framework, I was like, if I choose to look through this framework, I can explain every human behavior through parts. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying that it suddenly made sense to me. And I think about that too, the idea of, are these parts like pure IFS believes that all parts are a complete whole persona with their own history and their own thoughts and feelings. And you can literally believe that, or you can say that's just a model, but behave as though that's true and you'll get the same result. And I always like that distinction of whether you believe it or you just behave as though you believe it and you'll still get the same result. I think that's interesting to me.
I think it is. And I think there's an idea that I work with a lot, which is how you render up the problem dictates your options in terms of a solution. Now, however you render up a problem is never the truth of it. It's only ever a map of the truth, right? It's only a bunch of sense that's been made. So I really like that Werner Heisenberg quote where he said something like, the universe is not only more complex than you think, it's more complex than you can think.
Right.
So I take that, the universe there as a proxy for any complex system, like a person in their environment is a complex system, somebody doing their life. That's an unfolding complex system. So you're dealing, anytime you're dealing with psychodynamics, let's say, you're actually dealing with something more complex than you can think. So you have to map it, right? You need to know the map is not the territory, but you want a functional map that you can work with. To me, that parts model where exactly what you've just said, you go, okay, so each part is a kind of like separate part that has its own history, has its own origin story, so to speak.
Right.
That's a very functional map. And it enables you to do quite a lot of things because you can get into the history of the part or the history of the problem. That's very useful, particularly if you work with narrative elements as well, thinking literally of the story arc of the part. You can get some really interesting stuff going on with that. So that's really valuable. Marvin Minsky, I will say, has got a slightly more complex model. That doesn't mean it's of higher utility to a changework practitioner.
Right.
But it could be of interest. And this is why he uses the term agencies. Because it could be, let's say instead of part, you've got an agency. And let's say an agency is made of subparts, i.e. agents. Well, you might get the same agents working for different agencies.
Mm-hmm.
So they could work part-time for this agency and part-time for that agency. So certain skills you have could be utilized by one part or another part.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you could say, well, maybe those skills are just a separate part again and they interact or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think just going, okay, they're separate, but they can communicate.
Yeah.
And maybe they can share some things. They can share some knowledge, some ideas, some skills. That's a pretty useful map to have.
Yeah. A huge part of the way I work and continue to work with clients, but I do with myself, is I find I have many parts that are, I would say, healed and are resource parts that do something very well. And I form these little groups, little collectives. So when we find a part that has anything that I want to heal or get past or work, once that part is healed, I find the other parts that it wants to work with in the future situation similar to this. What other parts would be useful to have with you? And you guys create a little team.
Yeah.
And they literally create a name for their group and they all agree that they're going to work together.
Yeah.
And it's a very specific framework of working, but I love it so much. And I've never had a client not enjoy that process. And I've had great results with that.
Yeah, that makes sense, I think. And again, I'm thinking of narrative therapy, where they often have the idea of allies. So like in narrative therapy, one of the things you will do first off is externalize the problem. So we're talking here about that distinction of a part of you versus a part from you.
Right.
Narrative therapy always they won't use the term parts, but it's the same concept in a different set of clothes.
Right.
So once the problem is externalized, it is a part from you. You are not the problem. But you might be curious when you're working with a client that way, you might be curious as to what that externalized problem, whose that externalized problem's allies are, which could be other parts or other things, right?
Right.
So you get like, there's always this idea that there's little collectives that can work together. So what sorts of things work as allies to the externalized part? And you can do the same with resources. So again, looking at narrative therapy, again, they wouldn't say they're a parts work model. I just happen to see the parts work inside of it in a sense.
Right.
You've got things like they're interested in externalizing the problem. You get the history of the problem. You get the kind of allies of the problem. But you also get the history of various resources, i.e. resource parts as well, and the allies of those resource parts. So there's a kind of like a real feeling of looking at these collectives. One of the things I think that narrative therapy does nicely is throws a lens on the meanings of these things as well, which can sometimes get missed out of other models that are based on parts. So they kind of play a game where they're sometimes separating certain things out from the client, but certain other things they're making a part of the client's identity.
Yeah.
So the problem parts often get separated out and then resource parts get rendered up as part of the identity.
I think it would be interesting, if you don't mind. I'm going to share the last sort of breakthrough I had with IFS and a client in the session with me as the client. I think some folks might, and I'll tell you how I did it. And so working with my therapist, I had a part kept coming up. I noticed and realized that I was worried that I like her so much and I like working with her so much that there was a part that was worried I was going to say something wrong and she was going to stop working with me.
Right.
Like that kept coming up. And so finally one day I said, I just need to speak for this part that keeps coming up. So when I connect in with parts, I see a visual, I see a shape or a color or a size or shape. This happened to look like sort of like Humpty Dumpty. This is what I love about parts for people that see things. It's just fun to me. It's so interesting.
Yeah.
So it was literally a metaphor for walking on eggshells. I realized later, probably is where that shape came from. But I connected back to that part. And what are you worried about? Or why are you, what is your intention? What is it? And I realized that it was worried that I was going to say the wrong thing. Anyways, we connected it back to 4-year-old Ruckus in this year and a half around my parents getting divorced and me thinking did I have something to do with it? Was it my fault? Right. And so that I've never connected a single, this is why I found this one interesting, a single part. Usually it connects back to a moment, a memory, a time. This connected back to, I don't know if you would call that a gestalt of a year and a half of my life. And so when I later went back offline by myself, it only took like an hour. I did a memory reconsolidation timeline type of release of keeping all the learnings, releasing the emotions. And anyways, that was hugely healing. That went away. I've never had that thought again with her in a session. That's one little idea of how much I get out of parts work and how enjoyable that is.
Right.
I just wanted to share that. I just love the way that works.
I think, so I can really relate to that. It reminds me of a situation I have for myself. I live here in an apartment, as you would say in the US. Sometimes I'd go out of the flat and I would hear that one of my neighbors was in the stairway.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would do, and people are going to say, James, you unfriendly, but
you would wait.
I would wait because it would just be easier for me to not get into, an exchange or whatever. Now, but there was also a part of me that was judging myself for that.
Right.
Now, this is such a trivial thing in some ways. It's like, there's a part of me that's like, what the heck? Go out, talk to your neighbors. What are you hiding for? What are you hanging back for? There's another part that's like, yeah, easy life. I can just get down the stairs, get on with my day. I don't have to get hooked into anything. So I had this kind of ambivalence going on. Now, the thing about this is, which of these parts is the problem? If we want to frame it in terms of problem, because this is what we naturally do, and I'm a changework guy, so I always say it's about making changes, it's not about solving problems always, but people do tend to think in terms of there's a problem here and there's something I want to solve.
Right.
So I could side with the part that goes, no, just go out. What the heck's wrong with you? Just go and talk to your neighbors. Or I could go, no, actually, this part's got like a good justification to it and it wants to hang back and it's just making the day easier, taking away friction. All of that. Now, I'm curious about this. So I want to feel into the system. I don't want to pick a side and go, right, I want to learn something. I want to feel into the system. I want to learn something about this dichotomy. So the part that wants to not go out, to me, when I felt into that, now I use felt sense a lot. And to me, it's the same as parts work, right? Again.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that because I have a question about that. Keep going.
Yeah, so like myself, my default kind of parts work thing is once I got the parts, I'm going to go into it through the felt sense sort of nexus, so to speak. So I go in and I'm like, okay, so what does this part really want? Because I can hear its justifications. Oh, it's making the day easier, this, that, and the other. But what does it really want?
Right.
And when I feel in through that nexus, and here we go, we're in the therapy mode of revealing our deepest parts of their fears and desires.
Right.
What it really wants is it wants to avoid a situation in which I might be rejected. That's the truth of it. It's like I avoid the situation where I have to process acceptance or rejection from somebody else. Now, none of that's going on consciously, right? None of that's all way outside of consciousness.
Right.
And we were having a discussion and I was joking about my avoidant attachment style.
Right.
That's that, right? It's right there. There it is. It rolls out. That's not come from some kind of deep, I read a book on it and that's coming from feeling the way into the part and going, okay, look, there's a part of me that just wants to stay quiet and avoid people and stuff like that. So that's kind of really useful because working with that part ultimately, even though it's just a small thing now, that's a small manifestation of it, but kind of working into it, I had some experiences around it, but that actually was manifesting in a lot of other places in my life that I didn't realize it, right? There were a lot of places where basically I was kind of hiding in subtle ways, hanging back, because I'm hanging back before going into the stairway, right? And that kind of hanging back was manifesting in a lot of subtle ways in my life. So where I'm at right now, I've done a bunch of work with that and some stuff has occurred. And I am hanging back considerably less than I used to be, 90% less. There's still 10% hanging back going on, but that's okay because I've not made a rule that says I must not hang back. Do you see what I mean? It's like, that's absolutely fine. But that reminded me, your story reminded me of that because it's like a part that you could go, well, that's an innocuous thing. It wasn't a big deal.
Right.
Not a conscious big deal, but because I've got that parts frame and I've got a tendency to look at my own behaviors, and particularly when, to call that a conflict is too strong a term.
Right.
But it's an ambivalence. It's like, part of me thinks I really ought to just ignore that, go out and not be hanging back because somebody's in the stairway.
So talk about specifically the moment when you figured that out. What did you actually do to come to that conclusion where you understood?
Because the thing, and people who are familiar with my words will recognize this phrase. I often point out that we human beings are by default very poor witnesses to our own processes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you really want to get into self-transformation stuff, and this is true whether you're doing change work or whether you want to do self-change work. And I've always said that I'm a self-change artist before I'm a, practitioner of change work with other people. It pays to be able to be a witness to your own processes and an honest witness. And most people don't do this because every time a part activates, let's say, they lose their consciousness to that part.
Right. It takes over.
Yeah. That's the default state.
It's running the show. Yeah.
So they're not stood in the line watching people riding the roller coaster. They're riding the roller coaster.
Right.
And they don't even see necessarily that it's a roller coaster, so to speak. So people get caught up in the activation of the part. And the way I often say this is a part, when it's activated, creates a trance. And what I mean by a trance is automated behaviors now emerge. So when that part activates of me hanging back, if I'm not aware of it, I don't even notice it. I just hang back. An automated behavior of hanging back, of not opening the door, of staying where I am, emerges from the part. I don't reflect upon it. I don't get to reflect upon it. The other reason I say this is a trance is because every other aspect of who we are and how we are will often go away in a moment like that. Mm-hmm. Or almost, but there might be another part that has some ambivalence and we don't really see it. We just kind of feel a bit of push-pull or something like that. So the first thing for me, and this is true in change work or self-change work, is to create a witness consciousness. So we've talked about the 3 levels of mind model, which people listening to this may or may not be familiar with. But at that top level is the consciousness, the spotlight of consciousness.
Right.
To me, that's the eye that's going to witness the processes, witness the activities of the parts. That's the first thing, be apart from the activity of the part rather than being a part of the activity of the part. So I want to be able to see it first. And then the next thing is to be able to inquire of it without prejudice and without judgment. Be curious. What is it that's happening here with this part? Because in the story I told, I also caught, as I witnessed the process, the part of the process was a series of justifications, rationalizations for why it made sense to hang back and not go out. And they're all pragmatic justifications. They're all like, well, I just don't want to get caught up in a conversation. I want to be able to get on with my intent. And those are valid, but they're not the real reason.
Right.
They're just post hoc rationalizations that part has got used to deploying to justify its behavior. So for me, it's that witnessing. Now, once I can witness that and I can see it, I go, I see you. So I often use that with clients and myself. I see you. I see the activity.
Right.
And now I'm really curious, so without judgment, what is it that this is really about? So when I'm doing the self-processing work, I don't go, what is the positive intention of that part or anything, or what is your positive intention? I will often just feel in and go, what could this be about?
Right.
And I know what I'm looking for as I feel in. I know I'm looking for a kind of intentionality, and there's a protective mechanism. It's keeping me safe from something. It's about safety. It's not about pragmatism of being able to get on with my day. It's about safety. Mm-hmm. So there's some threat being processed in it. So I can go into the system. I can look at the threat. I can experience it, and I can start to allow it to dissolve. So even taking a Jen-Lin-esque felt sense approach, which again is very much parts work, even though he's not talking about parts, once you are able to be with that and be an honest, unbiased, unjudgmental witness to that, even that level of being with an acknowledgement usually changes how the part is expressing. So people usually experience an immediate shift.
Was there a moment where you caught yourself avoiding, and did you literally stop and do this process and come to that realization?
For me, I do a lot of self-processing on the fly.
So you did it right then in the moment?
So I'm doing it right then and in the moment, and then at various points throughout the day, because the way I tend to work with myself is I go, there's a thing I'm interested in here. There's something that I want to work through. So a lot of the self-processing stuff I will do when I'm out walking the dog,
Right.
or there's a slot later in the day where I'll come back to it, and I might work with it over a few days, sort of in the gaps of my life, instead of going, right, let me schedule that, and I'm going to take some time out and do a process. Now, it might be, I go through different phases in my life, and up until relatively recently, I was doing quite a lot of formal self-hypnosis sessions, or self-changework sessions, you could call them.
Right.
So if I'm going through a phase of life where I am doing more formal stuff, I will bring that material into those sessions. And I actually did a piece of work on something similar to this. I think it was probably this part, but worked within a different way at a different time. About 6 or 8 weeks ago, I think. And I had a really big shift as a result of doing that actual formal piece of work set over in the corner of this room over here.
Yeah.
So I do formal work, but I do a lot on the fly. And I think what happens, by the way, as a result of doing this is true whether you do change work or not. So I see change work when I'm working with clients. I don't see myself as reprogramming them. I see myself as actually working with them co-creatively, and they are learning from that without me explicitly having to say, I'm teaching you a lesson, right? They're not. They're just, usually people, when an issue comes up or something comes up, they always respond one way to it. And it doesn't even occur to them that they have a choice in how they might relate to that experience. But when people start relating to experiences differently, doing different things with that, which you might do through hypnotic processing, there's a part of them that's learning a new set of relationships with themselves, which then generalizes out in life. So this is like, there's a generative effect that can happen when people work in a certain way with their own experience, that beyond the particular issue they're looking to work with, they can start developing competencies and capabilities to do stuff unconsciously as and when they need to in their lives, which I don't doubt you've experienced for yourself.
When a part is activated and is basically running the show and it feels like that is you. Okay, ego state therapy calls that a part is being in the executive.
Right.
That's what I've learned. In IFS, they say you're blended with a part.
But there's another way that I render that up where I do a little sun in the middle, which I call consciousness. And I always say when the loop spins, the hypnotic loop spins, it kind of pulls consciousness into it. And that's what makes it come alive. So consciousness is always, your consciousness gets pulled into things. This I, this sense of I, this kind of raw consciousness, I am and I can, a sense of self and agency. It is unstructured until it gets pulled into some kind of set of responses, which is, we could call it an activation of a part or an ego state or something like that. At which point it kind of comes alive. And this is a line from a guy called Stephen Walensky. He said in his book, Trances People Live, and this was like a throwaway line. He didn't really make sense of it, but it really stuck with me. He said, all trance is identity. And he didn't really explain what he meant by that, but it always stuck with me. What does he mean, all trance is identity? It was like a koan for me or something. And the sense that I made for it is when a trance fires up, which to me you could call the activation of an ego state, or the consciousness being pulled into the ego state, or whatever the other versions you were talking about. It's literally like you fall into this illusory state where this is all that I am. Everything else, and I use this line over and over again, everything else about who you are goes away. You know, it's totally gone.
One of the great things I've come out of all the parts work I've done is that anytime I have an extreme emotion or feeling of what I don't even like labeling them, but it's something is negative, like I was angry or upset or frustrated or whatever, I know that that's not a feeling I want to stay in. And I literally just stop and go, I know there's a part behind this. I don't know what the part is necessarily. It's not unless I've connected with it before, but I'll just talk directly to that part and I'll say, hello, like you say, hello, I see you, the thing, but I'll say something to the effect of, I know that you have a very positive intention for me, and I so appreciate that. And I really, I have to be genuine about that.
Yeah.
I really do appreciate that. But right now, I really need to accomplish some other things. Would you be willing to give me space if I promised later on this evening to check back in with you and you can tell me anything you want?
Right.
And I've never had one not go, okay, and it relaxes back.
Yeah.
As long as my rule that I always keep is I have to really genuinely check in with them that night before I go to sleep. I stop and check in and say, hey, I want to talk to you. Tell me was there anything you wanted to tell me about what you were trying to let me know? Anyways, I've been able to control my emotions, quote unquote,
Yeah.
so much more by just that little simple, it takes like 15, 20 seconds. And I find myself doing that all day long, every day. And that's just come out of doing parts work.
I think that I do something similar. And something I'll say about this is there's a lot of things that I used to do like in a more formally ritualistic way, which I could say, I don't mean to dismiss what you're doing as ritual, but ritual is a significant thing. Going through a ritual of saying, I acknowledge you and I see that you have a positive intention. That's a kind of ritualistic relationship.
Sure. There's a framework.
There's a framework, right?
Yeah.
So what I've found across time is the more that you do these things, the less you need that, and the more you just have an intention. But that intention, the intention holds things like the honoring of the positive intention. So these days, I rarely think consciously about positive intention. But as soon as I'm relating to a part, I'm aware that it has a kind of functionality that I don't have to sort of remind myself or remind the part because it's held in the intention.
Yeah.
But I think that you ultimately get to that point, but it's useful to have the intention in the first place. However, the flip side of this is it's the intention that's important. So sometimes when people learn things like parts work, now one classic example of this is when they learn to do a 6-step reframe, and it really bakes my noodle, this does. People go, okay, so just thank that part for da-da-da. Like they're doing a step and the person says, thank you part. But there's no intention of gratitude. There's no real connection to it.
Right. It's not genuine.
Yeah. So sometimes the ritual can be done, and this is not what you're doing. You're doing it filled with intention and meaning and being with it in an honest way. But sometimes people can just go through the motions of, oh, well, I thanked the part. Yeah, but were you really seeing that the part was doing something for you? Did you actually experience any kind of gratitude to that part?
Yes.
And I think that that's the important thing. I think once you can get the genuine acknowledgement, the gratitude, you can kind of dispense with the ritual, but the ritual can help you get there. But you must bring that life to it, that reality to it, that real feel to it, so to speak, to get it to work.
So I completely agree that about it being a framework or a ritual. And I think what I just realized as you were explaining that I feel like the stronger I'm feeling, the more powerful that quote unquote negative feeling or emotion, the more the framework is helpful.
Yeah.
And if it's a smaller, lower level type of thing, that just understanding that I already know how to do that process is enough.
Right. And that would make sense because the framework probably provides a sort of set of anchor points that to keep you oriented to what you need to be oriented to. It's something I've been doing recently since November. Somebody showed me this really overly simple way of working with parts. And they showed me in November, and I want to credit a guy called Pradeep Agarwal, who's from India.
Okay.
And I've known Pradeep for years, and he showed me this thing, and he said, I'm going to show you this. I use this all the time, and you will make it better. I thought I'll probably make it different, whether I make it better or not. Anyway, so he showed me this parts work thing, which was super, it was too lazy that it shouldn't work. And this is what made it so interesting for me, is that I was sort of prejudiced against it, and it worked anyway. And that kind of blew my mind, because my rule is you've got to have buy-in. I didn't have buy-in, and it ended up working. So I was kind of...
You mean with a client?
No, with me. He did this on me
with you.
to start with.
I see.
So
okay.
This is in November at the UK Hypnosis Conference. And I'll just talk through it super quickly, and I'll miss a bunch of bits out. But he said, I want to show you this thing. It's just like a simple parts work thing. And I was about to do a presentation. And he said, so there's a part of you that knows how to present really well, right? And I said, yes. And he said, so I just want you to just close your eyes for a moment and ask your unconscious mind to activate that part now so that you are able to present super well this evening. I'm like, okay. So I did it. I activated the part, and then I went and did my presentation, and it went very, very well. However, at this stage, I'm still like, well, it would have gone well anyway.
Right.
I would have clicked into modes. So I was not particularly impressed by this at this stage. So the next day I saw Pradeep again. He said, I want to do the whole thing on you. I'm like, okay, we do it. And he did this thing, and it was mostly about activating parts that do X and deactivating parts that do Y. It was just literally, and I'm like, well, this is just way too simple. So he's taken me through some processes, and he had one. He said, do you have a memory that when you think about it, it still bothers you? And I said, yes. And I can't remember the order he did this, but he said, so there's a part of you that does joy or something like that. I think we got a resource part. He said, I want you to go back in, see that memory in your mind, and then just wipe it out and activate the part that does joy. Like, okay. So I've gone through it. This is basically a similar thing to a swish pattern from NLP, but using parts. So I did this a few times. I'm like, okay, yeah, that. And then he gave some suggestion, and he was talking a lot directly to my unconscious mind. So I think he was saying, unconscious mind, do this.
Yeah.
So to kind of close the loop on this story, I was still not particularly blown away by this at all. And in my mind, Pradeep was breaking rules about how things should work. Okay. And the specific rules he was breaking was, number one, he didn't have my buy-in for the process. Number two, the language he was using for me was way too intellectual. So these were breaking some of my personal rules, some of my cherished truths. Anyway, so he closed this process off by saying to me, he said, close your eyes. I closed my eyes. He said, do you believe that you consciously control your blood pressure? I said, no. He said, do you believe that you consciously control your heart rate? I said, no. And then he said, so you agree that your unconscious mind controls your physiology, right? And at this point I said, yeah, I guess. He said, so I'm going to speak directly to your unconscious mind right now. And he just said, James's unconscious mind, please remove from conscious control the control of James's eyelids. Now, at this point, I'm thinking, well, this isn't going to do anything.
Right.
And then he said to me, he said, so James, now consciously try and open your eyes. And at this point, right up until the point that I did it, and I'm not a great hypnotic subject, I was expecting that my eyes would open. And they didn't. So I'm like, oh. Now, he did this retrospectively. It's like, so he got buy-in for the other process he'd been doing after the fact he'd done them. Now, I was really surprised by this, that my eyes did not open, because I was sure they were going to open.
Right.
So, and he broke all my rules about how hypnosis should be done. So this was something that I was very interested in afterwards. Now, I kept thinking about this thing, this parts activation thing, and I started kind of doing it with clients. But not the way Pradeep had done it, but just simply saying to a client, let's say they've got anxiety. I started to see, what is the opposite of anxiety? And they go, well, calm. I say, so calm. So calm, right? You've had experiences of calm. They say, yes. I say, so there's a part of you that knows how to do calm. They say, yes. I say, so if you were to experience that part activating right now within you, you'd know it, right? They go, yes. I say, how do you know? So I would just start to activate that. And I say, and as you're doing that, you can deactivate that part that was doing anxiety before, and maybe that's already happened. So I was just doing this kind of thing like this with clients, and I was like, well, this is kind of interesting. With a lot of clients, this is really making a difference. It's really shifting their state. Anyway, I also had been having for a while, and have been for about the last year, they improved when I changed some things about my diet, but ongoing headaches. And I'd been doing a lot of self-hypnosis stuff to try and get rid of these headaches. And I'd been doing all sorts of strategies, submodalities stuff, releasing work, all sorts of things. I hadn't been really having a good lot of results with self-hypnosis and these headaches, using all these techniques that made sense to me, that really had a good rationale that I really bought into. Just wasn't really making too much of a dent in the headaches. Anyway, I was sitting there one time and I got this stinking headache. And I thought, it's not going to work, but I'll do Pradeep's, or my version of Pradeep's parts thing. So I've just identified within myself, I've just spoken to my unconscious mind, and I've said, so there's a part of you that knows how to turn off headaches, to get rid of headaches, right? Because I've got rid of headaches before, they've gone. There's a part of me that knows how to transcend headaches. I think that's how I put it to myself. So I just said unconscious mind, and it's like still a part of me going, this is nonsense. This is not going to do anything.
Right.
But what have I got to lose? Unconscious mind, please activate the part that knows how to transcend headaches. And please deactivate the part that has been doing this headache. And to my astonishment, given that I'd done lots of other self-hypnosis stuff that hardly made any difference, to my astonishment, the headache disappeared by about 90% immediately. And then the rest of it trailed off. But the interesting thing is, after that, the frequency of my headaches dropped also by about 90%, ongoing without me doing anything else beyond that point. Now, I will hold my hand up. I've been doing hypnosis for years. I've been doing change work for years. All of that was in the "this is too simplistic" category for me. So I mean, it's so minimalist. I've done nothing. I've not done anything with positive intentions. I've not, nothing. Just really, I'm just going to have this quick conversation with my unconscious mind, which I don't even buy into particularly.
Yeah, you started it by saying this isn't going to work, but you did it anyway.
And this is one of the big shifts that I've had in general recently is, I was kind of saying it earlier about, you really want to feel it and all of that. I've always believed that, and I still do think that adds a lot. But I'm now questioning, is it always necessary? So I always used to believe that any hypnotic process, it needed the person's buy-in, whether it's a self-hypnosis or another person. But now I'm like, well, I really genuinely think I had no buy-in for this. I genuinely believed that I was expecting it to not work. Now, if you were to ask me, what conclusions do you draw from this, James? I'd be like, I have literally no idea. I have more questions than answers. But I have taken to recently doing a lot more of this kind of simple, activate that part, deactivate that part. It's breaking the rules because there's no acknowledgement of positive intention going on.
Right.
And again, that doesn't mean that I'm therefore saying all of that stuff's redundant. I'm not saying that.
Right.
I'm just saying that I'm surprised by how much can be done, or I have seemed to be able to do with clients and with myself with just, oh, there's a part that's doing that. So I'm just going to deactivate that now, and I'm going to activate this other part. It's just, oh, wow, that's way too simple. But it seems to be, much of the time, working really well. And it's got to the point now I'm almost scared to do it because I don't want it to stop working because it's been working so well. I'm like, oh, shall I do that thing? Well, I don't want to risk it not working this time because it's been so fantastic so far. But so this is what I mean by, I've started calling it super lazy parts work or whatever. And again, I do want to emphasize for anybody listening to this, I'm not saying that this is all you need and, you don't do other methods. I'm just surprised by how much I've been able to get from this. But it might also be, that might be predicated on how much parts work I've done before.
Right.
And how much unconscious competence maybe I've got with it and all of these kinds of things.
Yeah. It was like we were saying earlier about a ritual or a framework and like how eventually you don't have to do all the steps. You just know it and you go in.
Yeah. So, but this is a new ritual that I don't have any particular, I didn't have any particular buy-in for.
All right. I'm making a note here. I'm going to find a time to try that out myself, and I'm going to circle back with you. And let you
just pick a little thing that you can do it with. Just run it as an experiment.
Yeah. When I would normally do some other version.
Yeah. And I always say this, by the way, like some people go, oh, resistance. Yeah. Resistance isn't really a thing. It's just inflexibility on the part of the practitioner and all of this kind of stuff. And I think Steve DeShazer of solution-focused brief therapy once held a party for the death of resistance. And some people are really into this. Resistance is just a limitation of the practitioner trope. I'm like, no, of course there's resistance. There's always resistance.
Right.
And that is how we work. It's a part of how we work. If a client didn't have resistance to change, if there wasn't a part of them that didn't want to change or wanted to retain some things that might get lost. Here's a good example of this. I was working with somebody yesterday who has a very, very unpleasant childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a diagnosis of complex PTSD from someone else. I don't work with diagnoses, but I'm happy to go with that. And it came to the point of looking at perhaps doing this reprocessing. And this person was like, if all of that stuff changed, who would I be?
Mm-hmm.
Right? she's tormented by this stuff, but it's also, she recognizes that it's made her who she is and how she is. And she's asking a very valid question. Will I still be me? That's not an invalid question. So somebody might go, well, obviously, someone who has a traumatic past would want to be free from that and would want to transcend that. Why wouldn't they? Well, because they might think that there might be a part of them that is going, but I won't be me anymore. I literally won't exist anymore. I'll be someone else. Do I want to be someone else? So there's an example. That's somebody coming in of where does a parts mapping work with this person, just right at the level of presentation. That needs to be dealt with, because we're not going to do any good work if I go, oh yeah, we're going to help you out. We're going to work through that complex PTSD stuff. We're going to start doing some trauma sweeping, or we're going to run the charge off some of these more key memories or all of that. Well, I haven't got investment from the part that actually really values so much of what this person has. This is the other thing. This person, on the one level, you could say this person has low self-esteem. But it's not true. There's a part of them that has low self-esteem. Mm-hmm. Now, when they were originally presenting, when they were had by the part that had low self-esteem, then that's all that was coming through in terms of the narrative. But once there was a risk to not existing anymore, it's like, well, why would that be a problem? What is it that you like about how you are? What is it that this has made you that you value? Boom, 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 boom. A whole list of characteristics and character traits that this person clearly highly valued. So it's like, oh, are we dealing with low self-esteem here? Or, well, that's a simplistic thing if we're not looking at it in terms of parts, right? Because there's a part of her that has a low self-esteem, we could say. And then there's another part of her that recognizes some very, very strong, resourceful character traits that are rare and unusual in human beings. And it's like, so what do we do now? Because we want to retain this stuff. She wants to know she can retain all of this without having to keep hold of the painful memories that perhaps formed it. So even if you're not necessarily going straight in with parts work, it can be a useful thing to be looking at the system in terms of ambivalences and apparent contradictions and resistances and these kind of things, because you've got to work with all of that. I worked with another client recently who was saying that she'd been to see a trauma therapist who had basically gone in, and the work that they tried to do was to change the content of traumatic memories. And she was like, but that isn't what happened.
Right.
So there's a part of her that is invested in holding on to truth. Now, the practitioner in that instance obviously didn't pace that part, because now I don't think you need to change the content of those memories. You just need to change the relationship to the content of those memories. And that, I think, would have got less resistance because it would have honored the part that wanted to retain truth. So often it's like, well, what are the different parts here and what are the values they align with? So a part that wants to retain truth, this is something that hypnotists can come up against sometimes if they want to play too fast and loose with reality. There's a part of everybody that wants to be in touch with reality and doesn't want to just go, yeah, let's play pretend. So I think it's a really useful way of looking at human beings, human dynamics, even when people are trying to understand other people. So I was working with another client the other day who was upset that they weren't getting support from people who'd said they would support her in a particular situation. Well, probably there is a part of those people that sincerely does want to support her, and there are other parts that want an easy life or don't want to avoid a difficult situation or whatever. But because she's not got that parts lens to look at the other people in her life, she can't make sense of them. What are they really like? People ask that question. What is this person really like? What's the true them? Do they want to support me or do they not? Well, if they could see that everybody is complex and there's a part that probably sincerely does and another part that's scared of what that might mean, for example, then it's like, oh, now I can understand these people better and I can relate to them better. So I think not only does it help us understand ourselves, relate to ourselves in more useful ways, it helps us also relate to other people better.
Now I'm so much more understanding when other people have a part that's very activated and they're very much doing something that I don't really like or appreciate.
Right.
I immediately understand, underneath that is a part with a good intention that the result of this isn't what they really want. But I relax around people and are much more forgiving. I don't say that person's an asshole.
Right.
Like I used to say.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that understanding things in terms of parts can be really healthy for someone's life, because if I go back to my history, I would take so much stuff personally from other people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But even if I was going to take something personally now, I could go, there's a part of me that wants to take this personally. Right.
Right.
But there are all manner of other parts of me that don't, that can be beyond that. But I can also look at the person and see the behavior I'm about to take personally isn't who they are either. So that's a part of them activating. It doesn't necessarily, it might be that there's something I've done that's triggered the activation of that part, but that doesn't mean anything particularly about me. It doesn't mean that I'm necessarily at fault, because I could have done an innocuous thing that triggered the activation of that part. And I think this is something that's worth, like with my youngest daughter, she's of an age where she's involved in all sorts of social groups and this, that, and the other, and there's all sorts of sub-politics going on. And there was someone recently that took a dislike to her for some reason, and she was quite upset about it. And she was saying, it's things like this that make me hate my personality. And I'm like, no, obviously I don't want my daughter to be having her self-esteem smashed up by someone, like we said, you don't see people as an asshole. In this instance, I'm like, by someone being an asshole to her, because there's a part that can do that, right? And I was saying to her, that's got nothing to do with your personality. Even if your personality has triggered a part of them that feels insecure or whatever for whatever reason, that doesn't mean that your personality is at fault. So it could well be that there's something in your personality that has triggered a response in somebody. But that's not, do you see what I mean? So like being able to get that, pull these threads apart, it doesn't mean anything about, like, so if I own that for myself, if I annoy somebody or I activate the part of them, it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with me.
Right.
That something I did activated a part in somebody else. And that part in them is their responsibility. 100%. Now, on the flip side, if I think, well, actually, I want to communicate a bit more strategically, then I can take responsibility for how I relate to that part in them and perhaps get a different result. So I do think that there's a lot of utility beyond therapy and change work and all of this. Just if you're looking to improve your ability to relate to the experiences of life, interact with other human beings, all of this kind of thing, I think there's a lot of value in a parts model as a self-development model, not just as a model for doing change work and therapy.
So there you go. Hope you enjoyed that conversation. I know I enjoyed having it. If you'd like to get in touch, you can reach us here at changeworkingpod@gmail.com. Give us your thoughts, any feedback, and ideas for topics. And if you have any questions, we'll try to answer those on a future episode. See you next time.
Changeworking is produced by Ruckus Sky. For information on training, go to clientshifts.com.